right, so good afternoon, everybody. It is high noon in Des Moines, Iowa, and I'm Bob Clements. I'm one of the owners of Benchmark Business Group, and I'm going to be your presenter today. Welcome to our webinar on increasing business value. Today we're going to talk about the 8 drivers that increase company value, but before we do that, for those of you who don't know who we are, Benchmark Business Group has been an international coaching company in all 50 states and about 8 other countries for the past more than 18 years, having coached businesses in every sector of the economy and of most sizes all the way up to Fortune 500 and Fortune 1000 companies. We have primarily been a small business to mid-market business coaching company. And since that time, we've also become and owned and operated a brokerage division to our company where we provide brokerage services on business sales, business valuation, succession planning, and other services related to the same small business sector of the market. So today, we're going to talk about 8 key drivers that increase company value, and these are 8 drivers that have been identified over several years and quite a bit of study by John Warrillow, who is the author of the book Built to Sell. And John Warrillow also formed a company called Value Builder, and we have had the pleasure over the past several months of becoming certified and collaborating with John Warrillow and his company in this particular endeavor. So today I want to talk about those 8 key drivers. And as we begin to think about the 8 key drivers, one of the things we need to understand is something about the demographics of small business today. Almost half of all privately held businesses are owned by baby boomers. In other words, there's about 28 million businesses in the United States alone, and about 12 million of those businesses, easily 12 million, are owned by people that are over approximately 53 years old or 53 and older. In other words, those are people that are in the next 10 to 15 years going to transfer or divest themselves of that business in some fashion or another. We also know that about 6 out of 10 of those people plan on selling in the next 10-year period. And finally, in Iowa alone, since most of us that are on this call are in Iowa, there are about 23,600 or so businesses in that category, producing about $57 billion in revenues. Now, all of that points to the fact that over the next several years, there's going to be more of a buyer's market develop within the business world. Right now, today, there are quite a few people selling businesses, but that number is going to grow considerably, and that becomes important to anybody who owns a business, especially in the category that we're talking about, because when there are more businesses on the market by many multiples, for example, those that sell are going to be smaller in percentage than those that don't. In other words, the ones that sell are going to be the ones that we would call shiny businesses that have really paid attention to their strategy for growth and their strategy for salability. In addition to that, the great majority of businesses are not worth what owners hope to get or are completely unsaleable. There isn't a week goes by that we don't do an evaluation that is somewhat disappointing to an owner, for example. We do plenty that are not disappointing, but we do some that are disappointing in the sense that many owners believe that their businesses are worth much more in some cases than they really are, and they really would be able to bring on the open market. The reasons are very unmistakable. And some of these reasons and some of the, I think the critical reasons have been identified by John Warrillow's group. They certainly are consistent with what we found over the years. And the problem is, even though the reasons are unmistakable, most owners continue to do the same thing and expect different results. Most owners continue to run the business as they have in a very ma and pa fashion or whatever their habits tended to dictate, and they continue to get the same results, and they're somewhat surprised by that in some cases. So the final thing that I want to talk about before we get into the 8 drivers is the fact that over a third of all businesses, and I think this is probably a very conservative statistic, are relying completely on selling their business to fund their retirement. In other words, they have no alternate means of funding their retirement other than the business itself. It is their 401k. It is their savings account, in other words. That is how they're going to survive, and that is how they're going to maintain anything resembling the lifestyle they had, is they're going to try to liquidate their business and glean something out of it. And the worst part of that is, of course, most business owners, over 2/3 of them, have no idea what their business is worth. In other words, their business is their 401k, their business is their future savings for their future life, and yet they have no idea what the balance is. It's like having a 401k and never knowing what the balance of that account is. So let's talk about the drivers. And these drivers are going to tell us what really makes a business more valuable, what detracts from the value of the business, and at the end of the day, it dictates some of the things that are looked at very carefully by business valuation folks in determining what the value of the business is. The first one is called by John Warrillow's group the Switzerland structure. Now, the meaning behind that name, Switzerland, as you know, has been a country that has been very neutral in many respects in past wars and past conflicts and so forth. And what he's referring to by this is most businesses are not really neutral in that sense. Most businesses have a great dependence on certain employees, a great dependence on certain vendors, and a great dependence on certain customers in order to survive. And so that really becomes problematic. And we're going to go into each one of these in detail as we go along. But that's the basic idea of the Switzerland structure. Financial performance is just what it sounds like. What's the business doing on a revenue basis? What's the business doing on a gross and net profit basis? And what's been the pattern over the last several years? What's its growth potential? Every buyer wants to know what the potential of that business is for growth. Every owner should want to know that, whether they're in the business, whether they're in the place where they're going to sell their business or not. They need to understand what their business's potential is for growth. Fourth, the valuation teeter-totter. This refers to cash flow. If you understand anything at all about running a business, if you've ever experienced it at all, when you hear the term teeter-totter in relation to cash flow, you instantly know what I'm talking about. You're talking about the ebb and the flow of cash flow, the untimeliness of cash flow, the almost unpredictability of it, and so forth. That can be problematic in the value of a business. The fifth one is about recurring revenue. Many businesses have a very transactional structure, meaning that everything they sell is based on a sale activity that is brand new every time it happens, and many businesses have very little in the way of recurring revenue, meaning that that's revenue that comes in regardless of what sales activity are going on, regardless of what the owner or the employees are doing. It's simply revenue that happens because it's structured that way. 6 is monopoly control. Now, that term can be a little misleading. It doesn't mean that we're talking about a business being an actual monopoly, but what we are talking about is that it is a business that is a preferred business within its own geographic area, within its own industry sector, and so forth, because of the way that it runs, because of what it does and how it does it. And so the more a business can claim to be somewhat of a monopoly in an area, and as you may know, one of the chief criteria used by the Buffett organization, by Berkshire Hathaway, in determining whether to invest in businesses is whether they seem to have a consumer monopoly in the area of their service, in the area of their sales, and in the area where they do business, the sector where they do business. The 7th is customer satisfaction. The extent to which your customers are loyal, the extent to which your customers become essentially part of your marketing department because of their referrals, because of the way that they view you as their preferred vendor is going to have an impact on the value. And then finally is a term John Warrillow likes to call hub and spoke. And when you think of the owner of the business as the hub, when you think of the owner of the business as driving everything that's going on in the business, so that the owner has his or her hands on everything that's happening in the business, that business is very owner dependent. The owner is the hub, and the spoke is everything that's happening in the business. To the extent that the business is owner dependent, it has an impact on value. So let's look at each one of these a little deeper, beginning with the Switzerland structure. What's the problem that exists in a business that is too dependent on certain elements of it, such as its customer base, its employees, or its vendors? Many businesses that we see and have seen over the years have an aging customer base. There is a very unreasonably small number, unusually small number of new business customers that the business acquires every year. The business relies upon the same customers coming back to the business over and over again, and that customer base is disappearing over time, simply by virtue of age and simply by virtue of time. There are too few customers in some businesses where it has revenue sources that are concentrated. If a business has more than 15% of its revenue dependent on a single customer, there's volatility. There's danger in that, because if that customer leaves, that's literally, for most businesses, the net profit. In other words, that much revenue has walked out the door, and there's very little stability in that, in our view. Employees have operating knowledge in their heads. In other words, as you walk into most businesses, there are no systems in reality. Certainly there are no written systems. Certainly there are no documented ways of doing things. The employees simply know what to do. And the owner says, well, I've got a great bunch of employees, and if I leave the business or I go away someplace, they're going to take care of things. The real question is, what happens if they're not there? What happens if the employees decide to move on for one reason or another? It could be a very innocent reason. It could be that their spouse gets a job in another city or another location. To that extent, if a business becomes very employee dependent or people dependent in that way, it has volatility. Every buyer of a business is going to be very concerned about whether employees are going to stay or not if that buyer takes over. Turnover, as you know, can be very expensive and very disruptive. If the business especially is not systemized in any way and not turnkeyed in any way and not orchestrated other than around the people that may or may not leave. There's no clear succession strategy for key people in many businesses. There are many businesses literally that are operating with people that have been there for a good number of years, and those people have an extraordinary amount of knowledge of how that business operates, and yet they're almost as close to retirement as the owner is. So what happens then? That's the next question. What's the strategy for the next person who's going to fill the shoes of that very knowledgeable employee? On the vendor side, in the vendor category, in some businesses there are a few supplier alternatives. In other words, the supplier, kind of has you captive in the sense that you have very few alternatives, both in terms of being able to get competitive pricing, in terms of being able to make sure that your supply is there, and if the relationship falls apart for some reason, you have insufficient alternatives to make sure that you have the material or the supplies you need. And there are no transferable supplier arrangements. In other words, most arrangements in businesses with suppliers, both based on credit and based on that supplier's responsiveness to the business, is based on a relationship. It is based on the fact that they've been doing business with the same person for many, many years. And so the question becomes, in the mind of someone taking over the business, how is that going to transfer in terms of the new ownership of the business? So let's look at some of the solutions, and they may seem obvious. They may seem, sort of transparent, but they're as complicated as they are simple. Number one, reduce dependence on key customers. In other words, you need to think about diversifying your customer base. You need to think about creating a customer base that is in, constant growth, in a constant state of refreshment, and in a constant state of reevaluation of that base and expansion of that base, as we'll discover later under the growth potential strategies. You need to reduce dependence on key employees. How do you do that? You make sure that your business is much more systemized than it is now. In other words, capture the knowledge of how the business works in every aspect of the business, whether it's sales, production, delivery, customer service, or whatever it is, that needs to be a very captured process, like a McDonald's or like any other franchise or a Starbucks that you might think about. Reduce dependence on those employees so that those employees become masters of a process, of a system, but the system actually runs the business. And then finally, reduce dependence on key suppliers. You need to begin looking around to see if you have alternatives and begin to cultivate those alternatives so that they're available whenever it becomes necessary to make a change. And you need to begin to cultivate that sooner than later. Under financial performance, the first one is the most obvious, that the revenue in the business is either lackluster, it's flat, or declining. I can tell you in the world of business brokerage, in the world of business valuation, there is nothing that will drive value down faster than flat or declining revenues. If the revenues begin to decline anywhere in the process, it's a red flag. It's a red flag to bankers. It's a red flag to buyers. It's a red flag to, should be a red flag to you. And all the things that we're talking about here, all the elements of the business we're talking about here have to do not only with when the business is ready for sale or when you're thinking about trying to sell the business, it's something that you need to be thinking about all the time you own it. In other words, it's like living in a house and deciding to defer maintenance and defer the quality of lifestyle that you're going to have in the house until you get ready to sell it. That's nuts. It's crazy. You should absolutely make sure that your house is in order at all times, and that includes financially. You should be able to enjoy it all of the time that you own it, because the whole purpose of owning the business in the first place is to give you more life. The second thing that you need to be concerned about in this topic is that your gross and net profit margins are out of sync for the industry. We'll see businesses that have a decent amount of revenue, but when you look at the cost of goods sold and you look at the gross profit after considering the cost of goods sold, and then you look at the bottom line profit, they're completely out of sync with industry standards. They're making way too little. They're making way too little for the amount of effort and the amount of risk that they're putting into that business. And then finally, the financial records are in disarray and not current. It's very difficult to understand your financial performance, and it's very difficult to understand how you're doing financially if your records are in disarray, and your records are also in a format that's very difficult to understand what's working and what's not working. Typically what happens, as you might guess, in a small business is there's a lot of commingling between business activity and a little bit of personal activity. Sometimes it's very difficult to look at a set of books on their face and tell instantly what's going on with the performance of the business. You have to go in and make adjustments. When we analyze the financial performance of the business, we much prefer to see books that have been examined by an accountant or modified by an accountant in order to bring them in line with general accounting standards and to bring them in line with general tax standards so that we can understand what's going on with the business. Because oftentimes business owners simply misunderstand the categories of expenses and income and so on, and where they should appear on an income statement or where they should appear on the balance sheet. So the solution is, number one, seems obvious, increase your revenue. And you say, well, that seems simple. Everybody wants to increase their revenue. But part and parcel of that is understanding your marketing strategy, which we're going to address next, is understanding where your greatest opportunities are within your business. And most business owners tend to do, habitual things and the same thing over and over again and rely upon the same means of revenue and the same ways of achieving revenue growth. So you need to begin to look at your business anew. And so that then brings up the idea of increasing your profit margins. You need to look at your top line, but you also need to look at your bottom line. And I would say my best advice is focus first on the top line and then begin to understand your bottom line and your margins and how you're costing your products and so forth. And then finally, formalize your bookkeeping. Make sure that your bookkeeping is shipshape. Your bookkeeping makes sense. Your bookkeeping is clean, because that, if any, among anything else, is going to impress the outside buyer or the outside banker or whoever it is that's looking at your financial performance, because it says you know what you're doing and you have an idea, you have a clear idea of what your financial performance is about. The growth potential is usually impacted by the lack of a written marketing strategy and plan. Very rarely do we get into a business and see a clear written marketing strategy. There's a failure in most businesses to understand the most probable and the flanker markets, the flanker market being not your central demographic model, not the person you're most likely to have as a customer, but there are other potential customers that may buy your product on occasion or may buy, some aspect of your service on occasion. So they would be called a flanker market for you. Your most probable market is the one that is the most likely to buy from you on a regular basis. It's understanding your market share and your demographics. For example, if you have the greatest market share in your market, that's a sort of a negative sign for growth potential, and you have to begin looking outside of your geographic area, outside of your demographic area, and so forth to understand what your other market opportunities are. It's actually good news when we hear that someone only has a 5%, for example, market share, and there's a large opportunity for growth even within the prevailing market. And then there's a stale or non-responsive product strategy. Coupled with your market strategy is not just about who your probable customer is, it's what products you're selling and what your product market grid is in terms of the kinds of things in terms of products that are going to bring the greatest profit and the greatest margins to your business. So the growth potential is about understanding the possibility of new products to existing customers. In other words, how can you serve your existing customers better? How can you cross-sell to those customers? How can you add more customers? The more new customers, and we would estimate that you need to be looking at around 20% new business every year or higher in order to have a sustained business that's growing and growing in a healthy way. There's the possibility of entering new geographic markets. There's a possibility of entering new demographic segments, meaning categories of people, types of clients, descriptions of who those clients might be and what sector of the economy they come from. The valuation teeter-totter is, as you may remember, it's the cash flow issue that happens within most businesses. The problem for most business owners is that they involuntarily finance their customers. They collect the cash, way too late. They allow the cash to sit out there way too long, and or even by their terms, they're collecting long after the expenses that they've incurred for delivering the product and making the service happen has already been paid for by the owner. So the owner has paid their help, the owner has paid all their expenses in connection with delivery of service, and they send a bill out that is usually paid within 45 days, sometimes 60 days, sometimes 90 days. The receivables get too high, the receivables get too old. Obviously, the older they are, the less collectible they become. The higher they are, the more difficult they are to collect, at least on a lump sum basis, if not in general. There's a lack of a cash management plan. In just about every business that we see, they might have some form of income statement or some form of balance sheet or some form of, what you might think of as a traditional accounting type of statement, but rarely do we see a different statement that we call a cash plan. And the cash plan is something you look at daily. It says, where's the cash coming from? Is it coming from a client? Is it coming from revenue? Is it coming from bank borrowed funds? Is it coming from credit card funds? Where's it coming from, and where does the cash have to go? It's not a tax statement in the sense that you're talking about income and deductible expenses. It's simply a cash in, cash out, and what's the timing. That is a dial or a monitor that you need to be seeing on a regular basis within a business. So the solution is that, and this is going to, again, sound simplistic, you need to obviously improve your cash flow. How do you do that? You improve the terms by which you operate. You obviously, if you can, you need to be able to get cash up front for at least part of your service, for example. You need to reconfigure how you're going to collect from your clients for the services you performed. It might surprise you that in several types of businesses, many clients are perfectly happy to pay you something up front if they understand what you're going to do and when you're going to do it and how you're going to do it, and you clearly outline the nature of the services. You need to also get paid faster, right? So you need to figure out how you're going to reconfigure your model so that people will pay you faster when the job is done. It may be that you collect right on the job, and since we don't have a lot of time, I could tell you multiple stories about people who've done that and literally collect the day that everything is done in cash, and you know, they literally have no accounts receivable. But that, you know, that's something that could occupy us a webinar all by itself. And you pay your bills slower, and I'm not saying be late. I'm not saying be in default. I'm simply saying design your payment strategies so that they match your cash flow. Design your payment strategies so that you're paying on time, you're paying the vendor when you should pay the vendor, but not necessarily the same day you get the bill. It could be a little bit later in the month and be perfectly on time as far as the vendor is concerned, but you really have to relate it to your cash flow. The recurring revenue problem is one that can be perplexing for some people, and I think I would, you know, expand on this one a little bit. But in many businesses, their products and services are highly customized. Very few are repeated and replicated in the same way. So the business is really built on customized service. And in a lot of businesses, the delivery and service is not turnkey either. So there's there's a gap between, you know, what is normal in a business on a delivery and service basis and the systems that they have to do it. Many transactional businesses, or too many transactional businesses, or non-recurring businesses within the industry itself, and business is seen as a commodity versus a brand. In other words, the business is seen you know, by the client as somebody that they may or may not buy from. So there's little client loyalty, and so it's very difficult to create a recurring revenue stream from that kind of a client base. So the solution is, in the ideas of John Warrillow, for example, the more that you can create contractual relationships, auto-renewal relationships, what he calls sunk money subscriptions. Sunk money subscriptions are things like you buy a piece of equipment that requires a subscription service to continue using that piece of equipment, or you set up a subscription in general, or sunk money consumables. A good example of that would be leasing a copy machine where you have a maintenance agreement and you have supplies being delivered, and you have color toner and so forth that has to be purchased on a regular basis. And so basically you're looking at creating a model of service and products that have some recurring nature to them. And then I would take it one step further, and I would say that in businesses that can't do that or won't do that because of the nature of their product or their service, I think the closest you can get, and many businesses get very, very close to this, you create such an extraordinary brand model of delivery and brand model of service, of turnkey service, that you have a very, you know, recurring customer base that keeps coming back over and over and over again, and actually becomes a strong part of your marketing strategy. This is something we'll address next under monopoly control. Monopoly control, as I said, sounds, you know, maybe a little bit stronger than it really is. We're not really talking about a monopoly per se, but there's a clear and distinct difference between your products, your services, and your competitions. There are really three basic strategies that any business could enter into. One is called operational excellence or competitive pricing. One is product superiority or being a product leader. And the other is customer intimacy or owning the customer relationship. The last one is the most probable for most small businesses far and away. To become the product leader and stay there is a very expensive proposition, as you know. It's all about constant research and development. It's about constant innovation and so forth. It's about constant upgrading of products, which, you know, tend to get trumped in the long run by another product that comes out similarly. Competing on price has never been a worthwhile exercise for the majority of small businesses. It's been a very difficult thing for most businesses to pull off. So owning the customer relationship is really the place where most people go, and that then becomes, you know, other than, as John would like to say, building a better mousetrap, it becomes a marketing strategy that makes you different. It becomes a marketing strategy that is about something people care about, and it's a marketing strategy that impresses people with the systems and the processes and the way that you do what you do. Customer satisfaction is about understanding whether your customers are loyal customers or promoters, as we would call them, or they're simply satisfied customers versus detractors. There's something called a Net Promoter Score that was developed by somebody by the name of Fred Reichheld and his team out of Harvard that actually created a promoter score that determined, and I'm sure many of you have answered a question on occasion that says, on a scale of 0 to 10, would you recommend our services or our products to your closest friends, relatives, and colleagues? And if you gave a 9 or a 10, you're likely a promoter of that business. If you gave a 7 or an 8, you're a satisfied customer, but, you know, not necessarily a promoter. If you gave anywhere from a 0 to a 6, you're probably a detractor. So the Net Promoter Score then is really about taking the 9s and 10s and adding them up and subtracting the 0s and 6s and ignoring the 7s and 8s. So the average American business has a Net Promoter Score of probably around 10, if you think about it. So they have almost as many detractors as they do promoters. Think of a business that has a very, very, very high percentage of promoters versus detractors. And you would be talking about a company like Harley-Davidson, for example, who has a score of 85 on that formula that I gave you. So in the customer satisfaction area, you need to really think about, I have a little glitch here, there it is. You need to be willing to survey and measure the score that your clients might give you. You need to be able to constantly look at what your clients are saying about you, whether they're promoters or detractors, and you need to focus on the verbatim response of the detractors. So finally, we're going to talk about the 8th one, which is the hub and spoke. The problem with the hub and spoke, as I talked about, is the business is way too dependent on the owner. The owner is usually doing the wrong work most of the time. The owner is usually doing much more technical work than they should be doing. Instead of running the business, working in the business instead of working on the business. There's too much operational knowledge that lives in the owner's head. If the owner leaves the business for any significant period of time, the business begins to decline because the business depends so much on the owner. The owner has essentially created a job as opposed to a business. In other words, this is a business that would likely not run anywhere near as well without that particular owner. That's obviously bothersome to a buyer. That's obviously bothersome to someone trying to put a value on that, because selling a job, you know, just simply doesn't have the same value as selling a business that works. So you need to create systems that employees can follow. You need to create your own stop doing list, determine what you're going to stop doing today, what you're going to stop doing tomorrow, and keep a constant list of what you're going to remove yourself from so that you're doing only the valuable work of the business owner. Automate as much as you can, if that's possible within your industry sector. And finally, take a vacation. See what happens. Take notes. Figure out what went wrong when you take a vacation, because that's going to be the area that you focus on when you get back to figure out how you're going to make it possible for that situation to change. So finally, and we're out of time already, but I want to give you one gift here. We're going to invite you, any of you, to do an assessment of your business online, absolutely free. There's no strings attached here. We only work with people that are clearly wanting help and clearly wanting assistance. But this is a way for you to find out not only where you fall in these 8 categories and what your score would be in these 8 categories as a business owner, but it also will enable you to figure out a rough value of your business, which we're also going to provide in the process based on your responses to the questions and the drivers. The time for taking the assessment is going to be about 15 minutes. That's it. So you're going to get an email following this presentation in this webinar, and it'll have a link with instructions on what to do. And after you take that assessment, you'll get a copy of it, we'll get a copy of it, we'll see a score, and we'll see a number of other scores on each of the 8 drivers, and then we're going to give you a free hour of consulting to help you understand those scores, to understand what you can do to change those scores and to improve the value of your business, actually to the point that you may double or triple its value. That's not unheard of in the world that we work in, and it can be a very, very significant number to those of you who own a business. So I appreciate your time. I realize we're over just a little bit. Thank you for your attention and the time you've spent here, and I hope you take advantage of this offer. Like I said, this is absolutely free, and I'm probably going to be the one to have this meeting with you, so you're going to get a chance to ask a lot of questions that may have come to your head today when you were listening to this webinar. So keep your notes because I'll be happy to answer any of the questions that you have. Thank you very much, and I hope you have an extraordinary day.